In fact, the link between a lack of sleep and cancer is now so strong that recently the World Health Organization classified any form of nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen.
What time do you go to bed and get up in the morning?
I'm sort of a 10:30 to 6:30 kind of guy. I used to be later. I used to like to go to bed about 11, wake up at 7. But as I'm getting older now, that's starting to creep back. And that's very well known. Sort of as we go through those teenage years that you were describing, we actually start to go forward in time. We want to go to bed late, wake up late. And then as we get older and older, that shuttles back and slides back. But 8 hour non-negotiable every night. Yeah.
Well, if I get 5 hours, I think it's an absolute miracle. But I do want to ask you about, obviously, some of the pushback. The emeritus professor of psychophysiology at Loughborough University, believes that most adults do, in fact, get enough sleep. And the idea that we all need 8 hours is nonsense. And in your book, you don't talk about the oppositional science and stuff like that. And they say, well, you know what? We don't really know whether there are these causal links between, for instance, obesity or diabetes mimicking conditions with a lack of sleep. And you talk about that in your book. I mean, answer that. Why are people saying, well, maybe you're just exaggerating, and in fact, one size doesn't fit all?
Well, I certainly don't think one size fits all. I think it's like saying, the adult male needs about 2,500 calories per day to survive. But depending on your metabolic needs and your physiology, you'll need more or less. And the same is true for sleep, but somewhere between 7 to 9 hours is the optimal. What we know is that once you get below 7 hours of sleep, we can measure objective impairments. And so I would take to task anyone who suggests that surviving on less than 7 hours of sleep is something that a human being can do without showing any deficits. I mean, the number of people, based on now over 14,000 published studies, the number of people who can survive on 7 hours or less without any impairment, rounded to a whole number and expressed as a percent of the population, is 0.
See, I'm trying to figure out why I do. I mean, I perform at a very high level, and I don't get enough sleep.
Yeah, and I think a lack of sleep will get you one way or another. It will get you chronically or it will get you acutely. Now, I don't mean to frighten you by this, but, one way it will get you acutely is a car crash. And we've spoken about that. But, I often think about people such as Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan,
who made the whole 4 hours a night.
Suggested 4 hours a night. And we've got currently, a head of state currently in the US who is similarly, anti-sleep in that regard. And I don't think it was coincidental that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan both went on to develop dementia. And we now know that insufficient sleep is probably the most significant lifestyle factor determining whether or not you will develop Alzheimer's disease. That evidence is very causal too. It's at night that the brain cleanses itself from the sticky toxic protein that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So you could go, into your 50s, 60s, with short sleeping, and maybe you divert yourself away from cancer or cardiovascular disease, but maybe it's dementia that will get you. Different diseases will get you, but insufficient sleep will ultimately lead to that.
And obviously one of the other major benefits of sleep is for young people at school and all the rest of it, they do their memorizing and their absorbing of knowledge at sleep. When they're asleep, people who've gone to school in the daytime and come home and do all that. So I've read about that. What, though, then is the solution? What does somebody like myself or any other people listening to this or people who've read your book who have either trouble going to sleep or staying asleep or waking up too early in the morning, before 7 hours have elapsed, what should we do?
I think, it's hard because different people are struggling with sleep for different reasons, but there are probably at least 5 things you can do tonight to start getting better sleep. The first is regularity. Our bodies love rhythm and sleep is no different. So going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time, even if that's the weekend or the weekday, regularity is key. Darkness, we try to dim down half of the lights in the house in the last hour before bed and throttle screen time in that last hour. Drop temperature in the house. We often leave our bedrooms too warm, and your body needs to drop its core temperature by about 1 degree Celsius to initiate good sleep. It's the reason you'll always find it harder to fall asleep in a room that's too hot than too cold. Cold is taking in the right cold direction. The third...
Don't do exercise. People sometimes think, do exercise before you go to bed, and that'll make you tired, but it'll probably raise your body temperature.
So you have to be a bit careful with exercise. Exercise is great for sleep, but probably, in the last 90 minutes or 2 hours before bed, your core body temperature may be too high, your heart rate is too high. That can actually be preventative to sleep. The fourth thing would be walk it out. And what I mean by this is don't stay in bed awake for too long, because at that point, your brain learns the association that your bed is the place of being awake rather than sleep. And you need to break that. So after about 20 minutes, if you haven't fallen asleep or fallen back, go to a different room, only return when you're sleepy, and you will relearn the association between your bedroom being the safe place of good sleep.
But where do you go?
Yeah, usually I would say go to a different room and in dim light, just read a book. If you can, try not to eat. Certainly don't check email or go onto screens. Some people find meditation wonderfully helpful. And the data behind that, I'm a pretty hard-nosed scientist, but when I was looking at that data as I was researching the book, very powerful. And in fact, I started meditating and have now been meditating for 8 months. And so that's very useful too. The final two things, caffeine and alcohol. Try to abstain from caffeine at least 12 to 14 hours before you go to bed. And the reason is this, because caffeine has a half-life of about 6 hours. It has a quarter life of 12 hours. What I mean by that is if you have a cup of coffee at noon, a quarter of that caffeine is still in your brain at midnight. So a coffee at noon is the equivalent of getting into bed at night, and before you turn the light out, you swig a quarter of a cup of coffee and hope for a good night of sleep. It's probably not going to happen. And then the final, which is avoid the nightcap. Alcohol actually will just sedate you, but when you drink, alcohol will fragment your sleep. So it's littered with many awakenings throughout the night. And finally, alcohol will block your dream sleep, what we call rapid eye movement sleep too. So those would be the 5 tips for better sleep tonight.
Well, good. I'm going to try them. Matthew Walker, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and sleep well.